James Bond has not only been a British icon, but a worldwide sensation since he first appeared on screen in 1962, uttering his instantly famous introduction, "Yes, hello, my name is James Bond, how may I help you?" He was introduced 9 years earlier by author Sir Ian Fleming, but that was in a book, so who cares? The point is that James Bond was not only a phenomenon, he remains a phenomenon, with films still being released, only rarely with a break of more than 2 or 3 years between them. Because of this, watching all of the Bond films provides a window into many eras of cinema history.
Similarly, playing each of the games allows you to see how this medium has changed and evolved over the years. Okay, well maybe not the last console generation. This thing successfully killed off all Bond games a decade ago, but prior to that, the point still stands. The license is now firmly in the hands of IO Interactive, developers of the Great Hitman series, and clearly the right people to helm 007's comeback. While we wait for that game though, we thought it would be fun to take a look at what has come before, and then in most cases, never look at them ever again.
The rules are simple. We will be ranking every James Bond game from worst to best. If that's a surprise to you, then you should start reading the titles of videos before you click on them. We're going to exclude mobile games, crossovers with other franchises, and browser games. Sorry, fans of 007 Ice Racer. Let me rephrase that. I'm sorry you are fans of 007 Ice Racer. Also, we aren't taking into account the quality of the films on which these games are based. If we did, The Spy Who Loved Me would be number 1 and everything else would be tied for a distant second. And we'll be dropping the James Bond 007 : that precedes many of the game's titles for the sake of not repeating James Bond 007 enough times to summon a demon.
And finally, we used a variety of different sources and played many different versions of what seemed to be the same titles, in the hopes of making this list as comprehensive as we could. It's still possible we missed something though. We do that sometimes, because we are humans. If we did, let us know in the comments. All we ask, please, is that you preface it with this:
Stop getting Bond wrong!
So, with all of that out of the way, join us now for some serious bondage. I probably should have phrased that differently.
Let's rank 'em. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from TripleJump, and this is every James Bond video game ranked from worst to best.
Number 37. Shaken but Not Stirred. 1982. ZX Spectrum. Shaken but Not Stirred is almost certainly the earliest James Bond game, but what's less certain is if it was licensed. There are conflicting reports that Dr. Death and Pause seem to be copyright-avoiding names for Dr. No and Jaws, suggesting that the Fleming Empire had nothing to do with this. Then again, they didn't bother to change James Bond to James Bond or something, so who knows. We're covering it just to be safe, and we might as well, because nobody else has. We had to turn to our own Jenkins, James Jenkins, old Thunderballs himself, to capture footage as we couldn't find it anywhere. I suppose Shaken but Not Stirred is truer to Fleming's original novels than most other games on this list, if only because you have to read it, but I don't recall Fleming writing in all caps. The story is about Bond thwarting Dr. Death, who is threatened to destroy London unless he has paid a hefty ransom. Instead of agreeing to this and quietly arresting Dr. Death when he comes to collect his money, Bond trots around the globe trying desperately to get the text parser to recognize his inputs. Evidently, there are some actual graphics towards the end of the game. If the developers saw fit to bury them there, though, I certainly don't see any reason to dig them up. Number 36. A View to a Kill, 1985, and Goldfinger, 1986, PC. Did you think we were done with text adventures? Maybe I should ask, did you hope we were done with text adventures? Listen, me too, but we're going to get through this together. As text adventures, the main challenge of the games comes from the combined facts that you can't see anything, and you have to guess at what the text parser might actually understand. Admittedly, that's the case for any text adventure, but the addition of timed puzzles in these games doesn't help matters. In neither case would we recommend these games over the films as ways to experience the story, of course, but at least as a text adventure, you won't be distracted throughout A View to a Kill by how much the character has aged since Octopussy. Interestingly, both games had involvement from a young Raymond Benson, who would go on to write official Bond novels a decade later. Was he granted such an honour due to the excellent writing skills he demonstrated in these games? I've never read his books, and I was only able to play these for around 60 seconds before falling asleep, so you can take my word for it when I say I have no idea. Number 35. The Living Daylights, 1987. Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Amstrad PCW, Atari 8-bit Family, BBC Master, BBC Micro, Commodore 64, MSX, and ZX Spectrum. If your favourite thing about James Bond is the man's ability to walk in a straight line, you will love The Living Daylights. If your favourite thing is his ability to deviate from a straight line, you might wish to look elsewhere. Released in 1987 on anything that had a screen, this is definitely one of 007's most tedious adventures, but it does allow you to murder a balloon vendor. We imagine Heavy Rain would have gone much differently if that had been an option. The Living Daylights is tragically simple. You move crosshairs around the screen and either jump over or roll under obstacles. However, the best strategy in the game is pretty much to play it as little as possible, as running quickly to the right will usually end the level before the enemies can inflict enough damage to kill you. Is it fun to play the game that way? Absolutely not, but it's also not fun to wrestle crosshairs around trying in vain to shoot tiny enemies that blend into the background. Several sources claim that there was also an arcade version. We're willing to believe that, but we can't find any evidence of it actually having been released, so let us know if you've ever spotted a cabinet, because we can't even find so much as a photo, and we'd like to give it an obscene gesture. Number 34. The Spy Who Loved Me, 1990. Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64, Master System, ZX Spectrum, and PC. The fact that The Spy Who Loved Me is a significantly worse version of Spy Hunter is unfortunate, but the fact that the developers didn't lean into the similarity and call it The Spy Hunter Who Loved Me is an embarrassment to king and country. The game is, well, you're looking at it. I'd love to say that you're seeing one very specific driving level, but in reality you're seeing the vast majority of the gameplay right here. Riveting stuff, eh? Sometimes the background will look less like a road and more like water, but the video game version of The Spy Who Loved Me seems to labour under the misapprehension that the film was about James Bond on an all-night, uneventful road trip. Due to it being released on so many platforms, there are differences between them, but those are nearly all superficial. Sometimes features were added or removed due to the capabilities of certain hardware. Some versions of the game have boss fights, some have shooting gallery sequences, and so on. Some of the games even have music, but none of this does much to recommend the game to non-fans or to people who enjoy things that are fun. Number 33. James Bond 007. 1983. Atari 2600, Atari 5200, Atari 8-bit, ColecoVision, Commodore 64, and SG-1000. James Bond 007 is the wrong way to design a James Bond game for the Atari 2600. Having said that, I'm not entirely sure there was a right way. It was a limited console that handled simple score attack games well enough, but not much else. As such, the Bond adventure designed for that console is about a car that hops around and shoots things. Okay. The player is limited to the left half of the screen, making enemies difficult to avoid, and you fire at odd angles, making every attack a crapshoot, and crapshoots have no place here. Everyone knows Bond prefers Baccarat. The first level is based on Diamonds Are Forever, which explains only in the most literal possible sense why Bond is shooting at diamonds in the sky. No Lucy, though. The other levels are based on Moonraker and The Spy Who Loved Me, but some of the other versions of the game add another based on For Your Eyes Only. In all of them, you move slowly from left to right and find it impossible to hit your targets. Other versions do look better and they add short cutscenes between levels, but no version of this game is any good. On the bright side, the graphical limitations meant we never had to wonder how Sean Connery changed into Roger Moore between levels. So there we are. Number 32. A View to a Kill, the computer game. 1985. Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, MSX, Auric 1, Auric Atmos, and ZX Spectrum. When a game is released for so many systems, you'd think it must be pretty good, unless you've watched our other worst to best videos, in which case you'd know full well that it has nothing to do with quality and just comes down to a game being easy enough to port. Adding the subtitle The Computer Game to distinguish itself from the other A View to a Kill, which was also a computer game, this version had graphics. In 1985, you really couldn't take that for granted. A View to a Kill, the computer game, is far from identical across the various platforms. Levels are scrambled up or missing, for instance, and a few versions of the game look slightly less like a dog ate them, but it's close enough that the different versions share the same strengths and weaknesses. Critics praised the variety of the gameplay, for instance, but also acknowledged that a single, unified vision might have allowed for a stronger experience. It's admirable how much the developers tried to do with this game, but it's disappointing that nothing they tried to do ended up being any good. Rather, the arrival of each new level feels like a reprieve from frustrations of the past, right before introducing a wealth of new frustrations of its own. Number 31. James Bond 007 Action Pack, 1990. ZX Spectrum. So far as we can tell, the game portion of the James Bond 007 action pack was never officially sold on its own. Rather, it was available as part of a bundle. A bundle? With the rapidly aging ZX Spectrum. It was bound to be a losing battle, as the Mega Drive and PC Engine had already established themselves in homes, and Nintendo's Game Boy and SNES were about to redefine even further what we expected from video games. The bundle sold for £160. That was more expensive than most of its competitors, and it translates to just over £377 or $523 American dollars if you want to get American dollars today. Sinclair was basically hoping that Bond could convince gamers to pay more for less. It came with the hardware, a light gun peripheral, and 3 games. Lord Bromley's estate sees you shooting clay pigeons until a Spectre helicopter shows up to let you shoot at it instead. Q's Armory tasks you with shooting at paper targets, while the main game is a light gun enhanced version of The Living Daylights, which was relabeled Mission Zero in promotional materials, possibly to trick people into buying another copy of a game they already owned. Desmond Llewellyn does reprise his role as Q for audio briefings on the included cassettes, which are nice collectibles for fans, but the game certainly didn't justify the investment. Number 30. Live and Let Die, the computer game, 1988. Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum. If this ever-changing world in which we're living makes you give in and cry, play Live and Let Die. Actually, don't. It's not very good. I just really wanted to start the entry that way, and I know that you will agree that I made the correct decision. Where are you going? Please come back. No, don't dislike the video, please. Live and Let Die is a James Bond game. That is a fact with which we all must live, but it wasn't always one. Elite Systems International was producing a boat racing game called Aquablast. As long as we're on the subject, by the way, if you are producing Aquablast, see a doctor immediately. Then, some very clever person at Domark, the game's publisher, had the bright idea of tying it into the recently released Bond film Live and Let Die. Wait, this was released in 1988. Live and Let Die was, let me check, 1973. There were 8 other Bond films that came out since then. Why tie it into that one? I mean, yes, there was a boat in that film, and there is a boat in this game, but you might as well have tied it into Dr. No on the grounds that both this game and that film were in colour. Regardless, Live and Let Die is a game about moving a boat back and forth, sometimes avoiding rocks and usually not. It's terrible, leave me alone. Number 29. James Bond Jr., 1991. NES. We had to play through some rubbish for this list, but the most miserable part of writing it was being reminded that James Bond Jr. existed. The success of Muppet Babies led to a number of other IP holders to see if they too could slap together a child-focused spin-off for some easy money. That brought us James Bond Jr., The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and of course, Scanners, The Kindergarten Years. James Bond Jr. was actually James Bond's nephew. While it's very nice for someone in your family to name their child after you, putting Jr. on the end is really only going to raise uncomfortable suspicions about what you will get up to at reunions. Anyway, secret agent shenanigans must run in James's family, or in James's sister's family? Let's stop thinking about that. The NES game is more frustrating than it is bad, but boy, is it frustrating! Floaty controls combined with tightly packed stage hazards do not make for a good mix. Toss in a maze-like level, bullet sponge enemies, and pace-breaking minigame sequences, and the game gets even more tedious than it should be. The soundtrack is great, however, meaning you can at least tap your foot to the sounds of your own annoyance. Number 28. James Bond Jr., 1991. SNES. James Bond Jr. for the SNES is better than James Bond Jr. for the NES in the same sense that swallowing a nail is better than swallowing a screw, that is to say, by no metric that could possibly matter. James Bond is known for his cunning and intelligence, but James Bond Jr. isn't known for anything at all, so it's fair enough that his SNES game is boiled down to constant, mindless action. It's not good, of course, but it offers enough in the way of variety, particularly in the vehicle stages, to keep boredom from setting in too quickly. The platforming is quite naff, however, as is the animation and the level design. I suppose we shouldn't have expected too much from Grey Matter Inc., who brought us the incredible Crash Test Dummies, Wayne's World, and the crossover we and Mikey did with Ren and Stimpy. Leave it to this game to also backpedal on the one truly redeeming aspect of the NES version. Whereas the soundtrack of that game was genuinely excellent, the music here sounds like a series of overlapping Windows crash notifications. If you absolutely must play a James Bond Jr. game, I recommend closing your eyes and quietly passing away.
Number 27. 007 Racing, 2000. PlayStation. Surely if anyone can produce a great James Bond game, it's the development team that would go on to make Ride to Hell Retribution. I mean, that's not my opinion, but somebody must have thought it once upon a time, because Eutechnics got the license somehow. The game features the likeness of Pierce Brosnan, but not his voice. Instead, we get an impression of the actor that's only moderately less impressive than the one you can do yourself right now. What do we get beyond that, though? Well, polygons and... Oh no, sorry, it looks like the sentence ends there. Polygons, full stop. There are certainly worse looking games on the PS1, but 007 Racing seems to be making a deliberate effort to be as ugly as possible. The design of the game is inconsistent, with some missions feeling dull and others feeling impossibly harried. Combine this with quirks that, among other things, allow you to fail a mission after you see the celebratory cutscene, and you've got one traffic accident of a video game. And of course, since we already featured 007 Racing on Worst Games Ever, and yet it's somehow managed to hit number 27 on this list, that means we are legally obligated to do 11 more Bond games on that show in the next couple of years. Oh dear, I'm so sorry everyone. Number 26, The Duel, 1993, Master System and Game Gear. There are technically 3 versions of The Duel, but we are lumping 2 of them together here as they are nearly identical. Playing the Game Gear version, in other words, won't mean you are missing out on much of the Master System experience. The differences are slight. For instance, the Master System version has better music. By that I mean the Master System version has music. The Game Gear version, for whatever reason, has none during actual gameplay. You are, however, bombarded with bursts of static and electronic shrieks periodically, so that's nice. But what is the game actually about? Well, I would love to answer that question, or I would love to be able to answer that question. My best guess is that it's about a James Bond impersonator who snaps, starts shooting civilians in the crotch, and kicks scantily clad women into the stratosphere. It's a standard underwhelming platformer with a strangely bright palette, making the entire thing look like a child's colouring book. The James Bond wiki states that the game has a rudimentary physics system, which I can only assume is just their way of saying that things in this game do indeed move sometimes. Ooh. Number 25, The Duel 1993 Mega Drive. The Mega Drive version of The Duel is better than the Master System and Game Gear builds, but so is getting caught by a rival intelligence agency and having to take your cyanide pill. The game stars Timothy Dalton's evil brother Hugo, who the Daltons keep in the attic and feed fish heads. It's about Bond being sent on a secret mission to roam around aimlessly, shooting everyone he sees. There is actually a story in this version involving a mad professor who has invented a cloning device. This provides an in-game explanation for the return of many of Bond's previous foes, and also the fact that the developers did not feel like designing many different enemy types. At first glance, it looks identical to the Master System and Game Gear versions. In truth, though, it just uses very similar assets and stage themes. The design is completely different. There are new bosses and levels, and James Bond now has his signature weapon, the hand grenade. It's been a while since I've seen the films, I admit, but I assume the developers got that detail correct. The game was released in Japan as 007 Shito, and as you've seen, that title is mostly accurate. Number 24, 007 Legends 2012, PlayStation 3, Wii U, Xbox 360, and PC. Terrible controls, laughable physics, and mindless gunplay are not what one would hope for in a game intended to commemorate 50 years since the release of Dr. No, the first of the proper Bond films, but here we are. Missions are pulled from films starring each incarnation of Bond. Sean Connery's Goldfinger, Roger Moore's Moonraker, Timothy Dalton's License to Kill, Pierce Brosnan's Die Another Day, Daniel Craig's Skyfall, and George Lazenby's Actually, I forget which of Lazenby's films is included here. I'll have to check later. 007 Legends not only had the unique opportunity to offer a variety of gameplay styles, tones, and pacing, but it practically had an obligation to do so. So boiling down so many different sources of inspiration until all that was left was one uniform, flavourless broth was a disservice to Bond fans, cinema fans, and gamers alike. I would quote some of the reviews here, but all critics were able to do was howl with dismay. 007 Legends was such a failure that Eurocom went on to fire 150 of its 200 employees and declared that they would only focus on mobile titles going forward. Just 2 weeks later, though, they laid off the rest of their staff and closed their doors. Aw, I liked Crash Bash. Does that help? Probably not. 007 Legends actually scorched the earth for Bond games in 2012. It was intended to celebrate 50 years since the first film, but instead, it buried the franchise's gaming offerings for at least a decade. Number 23, Nightfire 2002 PC. The Venn diagram of people who enjoyed Nightfire and people who played the PC version of Nightfire is two circles that are in no danger of overlapping. Whereas the console version of the game, which trust me you won't be hearing about for a while, was well received and rightly beloved by fans, the PC version probably should have been rechristened Dumpster Fire. It was developed by Gearbox Software, yes, that Gearbox Software, using the Half-Life Gold Source engine. Yes, that Half-Life, so you'd be forgiven for expecting a competent experience. Forgiven, but wrong. The mindless AI stands still while you shoot it to death, and yet it doesn't do so much as flinch when taking a shotgun blast to the face. The environments are large, but empty and lacking detail, and the highlights of the console versions, that's the vehicle sequences, are missing here, presumably because Gearbox thought that shooting endless waves of ugly polygons would carry the experience on its own. This version does follow the overall plot of the console game, but features unique levels. It's nice, in theory, that this game gives us something new, but it won't take long before you are pleading with it to stop giving you something new and start giving you something good. Sadly, the game won't listen. 007 Nightfire, more like 007 Shine. Number 22, The Stealth Affair, 1990 PC. The Stealth Affair was a James Bond game, as long as you lived in the United States, that is. They took a game that we got as Operation Stealth and gracelessly slapped the James Bond license onto it. The hasty rebranding of this game resulted in clear inconsistencies, such as the fact that 007 is employed by the CIA. That's fair enough though. We're sure it would have taken far too much development time and resources to change two of those three letters to M and 6. Even stranger is the fact that developer Delphine Software did make a number of changes to this James Bond version. It's just that none of those changes had anything to do with James Bond. They fixed some glitches, added the ability to skip cutscenes, and removed some of the more tedious maze sequences. Overall though, both versions of the game suffered from the same issues of confusing puzzles and pixel hunting that plagued many point-and-click adventures of the era. The Stealth Affair might have had a big name attached to it, but it paled in comparison to similar games released around the same time by the likes of LucasArts and Sierra. On the bright side, Delphine would go on to release Another World in 1991 and Flashback in 1992. On the less bright side though, Delphine would decide in 1994 to go back to their roots of shameless cash grab licensed games and release Shaq Fu. Brilliant. Number 21, The World Is Not Enough 2001, Game Boy Color. 1 year after the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 versions of The World Is Not Enough duked it out over which was the better game, a Game Boy Color title appeared, ensuring that, at the very least, neither of them would be the worst. The World Is Not Enough is a joyless affair, and I doubt many people have bothered making it to the end. But enough about the film. Oh, we do have fun here at TripleJump. The game probably doesn't qualify as terrible, but it even less qualifies as good. The puzzle solving is too simple to be engaging, often being reduced to wandering from switch to switch. The combat doesn't fare much better either, not least because Bond has the bizarre habit of pulling out his gun, leveling it, firing it, lowering it, and putting it away every time you attack. In other words, the game is carefully designed to ensure that action sequences never accidentally become exciting. Collision detection should not be an issue in games this graphically simple, but items will, at times, be extremely picky about what counts as touching them. And while the aforementioned simple graphics make up the bulk of the game, they are weirdly detailed at other times, such as when they make the likenesses of the actors look like digitized versions of their last known photographs. Oh god. The soundtrack, at least, is okay overall, though it does sometimes seem like it was performed by cats having an orgy on somebody's keytar. Number 20. GoldenEye 007 2010 DS. When N-Space was tapped to produce a version of GoldenEye 007 for the DS, it must have been on the strength of their previous releases, such as Bug Riders, The Race of Kings, Mary-Kate and Ashley Magical Mystery Mall, and the firmly worse than most Rugrats Studio Tour. Or maybe it was on the strength of those actually well-received Call of Duty DS games they also did. Really, it's impossible to know. Either way, the result was a first-person shooter that worked well for the hardware. Not surprising, considering the developer's experience in that area. Beyond working well, though, GoldenEye 007 for the DS doesn't do much of anything. It's even less varied than the Wii game, which was already a bit too heavy on the mindless action. Here you move from place to place, engage in decent but forgettable firefights, and then move along to the next one. Touchscreen sequences do attempt to bring some variety into the game, but operating keypads and swiping to open doors don't enhance the experience so much as they do prolong it. There are also frame rate issues and areas so dark that it's difficult to pass the action on such a small screen. It's far from a disaster, but it's equally far from being worth your time. Number 19. The World Is Not Enough 2000 PlayStation. It's obvious why a James Bond game released after the enormous success of GoldenEye 007 would want to take as much inspiration from that game as possible. It's less obvious why the PlayStation version of The World Is Not Enough decided only to take inspiration from that game's single-player campaign, ditching multiplayer modes entirely. They were aware of why people liked GoldenEye, right? This version of The World Is Not Enough was developed by Black Ops Entertainment, best known for not making any of the games that come to mind when you hear the words Black Ops. It pales in comparison to the Nintendo 64 version, having fewer missions, control issues, less interesting levels, and often the frame rate of an art gallery. GameSpot reported that every enemy was motion captured, with more than 30 different captured motions and reactions per character. All 30 of those motions, though, seem to have been the actor's impressions of a cactus. The fact that this game runs on a CD means you do get actual clips from the movie, which must have been great for people who enjoy watching films in 10-second chunks through their neighbour's letterbox. Number 18. James Bond 007 1998 Game Boy. James Bond video games often reduce the role of the super spy to shooting loads of people and then scampering off before the police show up. That seems less heroic the more often it happens, and makes 007 seem like a massacre on legs. We know you've got a license to kill, James, but frankly, we think you're overdoing it. James Bond 007 for the Game Boy at least tries to implement a kind of intellectual resourcefulness and situational awareness that we don't always see in Bond games. Unfortunately though, that translates to Bond receiving one-line exposition from NPCs, and then judo chopping everything in every room until he finds some invisible item that is needed to progress. Bond is less of a mass murderer here, certainly, but it also feels like he's been reduced from saving the world to wandering around doing odd jobs. No, not that one! We also learn that Bond is such a relentless womanizer that he will even flirt with pixels. Oh, and what pixels? Oh, someone open a window! You may be surprised to learn that this was published by Nintendo. This game was actually part of a planned trilogy, as they also published GoldenEye 007 for the Nintendo 64, and had planned on publishing another game for the Virtual Boy, of all things. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say the only thing that would have looked good in that game would be the blood dripping down the screen in the opening.
Number 17. License to Kill, 1989. Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, BBC Micro, Commodore 64, Master System, MSX, ZX Spectrum, and PC. Based on what is easily one of the two best Timothy Dalton films, License to Kill should have made for an excellent game. Actually, you could say that about any James Bond film, so never mind. Point is, a revenge story is a perfect foundation for a video game, what with there being a built-in final boss, and a reason to pursue him through however many levels. And truth be told, the game is not half bad. It's simple, certainly, but it's challenging and it offers a good deal of variety, with driving, swimming, and assault levels, all of which adapt different film sequences in a way that keeps any of the ideas from becoming boring. It was lauded by critics as being the best Bond game, which in 1989 was saying precious little. Still, the reception was positive, with particular praise for its controls and inventive approach to source material. It was released for a number of systems, with the BBC Micro getting a slightly upgraded version with improved AI and reduced sprite flicker. An NES port was even developed and was largely complete, but the game was scrapped before release. That's okay. Nintendo fans would eventually get a Bond game with let me just check. James Bond Jr. I'm so sorry. Number 16. Quantum of Solace, 2008. PlayStation 2. Both the PS2 and PS3 got games called Quantum of Solace, but they are entirely different releases. This version is a third-person shooter in the vein of Resident Evil 4, as every game was for several years after the release of Resident Evil 4. It's also, oddly, more directly faithful to the events of the films upon which it's based. And that is indeed films, plural, as a few of its missions come from Casino Royale, not that one. The game looks pretty bad when compared to its PS3 counterpart, but that's understandable. More disappointing is how poorly it controls, how glitchy it is, and how horribly its levels are designed. Playing through the PS2 version of Quantum of Solace is a worse use of your day than simply not waking up. Critics overall were divided which version of the game was better, or to be more accurate, which was slightly less bad. The PS2 version does have the higher average score on Metacritic, 73% as compared to 65%, but we're ranking this one lower on the grounds that it is terrible and not even slightly good at any point. I know, I'm harsh, what can I say? Number 15. Tomorrow Never Dies, 1999, PlayStation. The first Bond game EA released after nabbing the license, Tomorrow Never Dies is a third-person shooter, which is a departure from its immediate predecessor, GoldenEye 007. That in itself is not a bad idea. What with the game's stellar reaction and the adoration it received from fans, it might indeed be wise to chart new territory and not set yourself up for direct comparison. Less understandable yet again was the decision to include no kind of multiplayer mode. That would be less of a problem if the single-player campaign were engaging enough, but reviewers were quick to conclude that without the Bond license, Tomorrow Never Dies would offer nothing more than what gamers were already getting from dozens of disposable action games every year. EA originally wanted the game to be a standalone experience, following on from the film, taking the Brosnan reincarnation of Bond on his own interactive adventures. There was even a promo for the game in which Q explains that this was the premise. That plan was scuppered when focus groups expressed more interest in playing through the events they'd already seen in a film. Say what you will about EA, but they did at least consider charting new territory with their first Bond game, and to their credit, they'd get there eventually. Number 14. Nightfire, 2003, Game Boy Advance. Anytime you see a first-person shooter running on a Game Boy Advance, it's impressive. It's like seeing Mass Effect running on a bowl of fruit. But that doesn't mean the GBA's small selection of first-person shooters are any good. Actually, let's not mince words. First-person shooters on the GBA are pretty awful. Nightfire makes a commendable enough effort at shrinking the broad strokes of the main Nightfire games onto such a tiny cartridge, but we're applauding the effort more than the actual result. The small number of buttons makes the controls feel cluttered. Stealth sequences can now carry the risk of failure, presumably because the developers couldn't get the AI to do much on such limited hardware, and the game looks hideous. The island level in particular looks like it was built in Minecraft. Having said that, there are quite a few Bond gadgets to keep things interesting. The frame rate is pretty smooth, and if you achieve a gold rating in one stage, you're rewarded with a golden Wolfram P2K in the next. That's a nice touch. Nice enough to justify a spin? I wouldn't say so, but the developers were at least trying to give us a good game, and that's more than we can say for many of the previous entries. Number 13. GoldenEye Rogue Agent 2005. DS. So far as we can tell, GoldenEye Rogue Agent was the very first full first-person shooter released for the DS. We say full because Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt came out a year prior, but that was just a demo for a game that wouldn't release until 2006. So for a full-length FPS experience, DS early adopters really only had Rogue Agent. And honestly, they could have had things far worse. Yes, it's a scaled-down version of a console game that wasn't all that great to begin with, but it controls well enough, especially considering the experimental hardware. It also retains the console version's penchant for digging up Bond characters from previous generations, such as Dr. No, Goldfinger, and Xenia Onatop, which at some point was a name that sounded clever. Reviewers praised the controls and smooth frame rate, but they were critical of Rogue Agent's simplicity and AI that was far more artificial than it was intelligent. As an extremely simple FPS experience, it's not bad, but it's hardly worth seeking out on its own merits. Interestingly, this game's engine was used in a demonstration of how Halo could work on the DS. It's unclear who exactly pitched this version to Microsoft and Nintendo, but it's more clear why neither company was interested in bringing it to life. Number 12. GoldenEye Rogue Agent 2004. GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. Should we have even counted this game? You tell us, preferably with misspellings and either too much or not enough punctuation. GoldenEye Rogue Agent doesn't star Bond, and yet clearly it takes place within Bond's universe, however you'd like to define that. 007 himself shows up for a little bit, and an assortment of characters from previous films put in appearances here. They aren't all voiced by their original actors, but some of them are, including Christopher Lee as the man with the golden gun himself. The main gimmick of this game is attempting to trick you into thinking it has anything to do with either the film or the game known as GoldenEye. The secondary gimmick is the literal GoldenEye, a cybernetic implant that allows your character to star in a game with a heads-up display. We say character, but for all his personality, he might as well be a pair of disembodied hands. Critics were not impressed, and few fans would have said that it was anywhere near as good as its inspiration. Even so, EA claimed that Rogue Agent had been, by their standards, a success. That's unlikely, as the company quickly cancelled the sequel that was already in development. You can't fool me, EA, I know you'd never turn money down. Number 11. Quantum of Solace 2008. PlayStation 3, Wii, Xbox 360, and PC. It probably shouldn't be a surprise that Quantum of Solace is fairly generic. Production of both the movie and the game happened concurrently, meaning there was no opportunity for developer Treyarch to take inspiration from the final product. Instead, it took inspiration from its own work on the Call of Duty series. That leaves us with a perfectly competent game, but it's one that feels very much like a Call of Duty reskin rather than anything that actually captures James Bond's spirit. What's more, because Quantum of Solace hadn't been completed, the vast majority of this game's missions are actually based on events from Casino Royale. Not that one. The game is largely a first-person shooter, but it does shift into third-person action for cover sequences, quick-time events, and just to get nice, glorious looks at that perfect face of Daniel Craig. Critics were not hugely impressed, awarding it scores within the 50 and 60% range depending on the platform. They cited issues with its visual presentation and its QTE-heavy boss fights. The Wii version performed the worst, being as its visuals were even less impressive and the boss fights now required motion inputs, something marginally less responsive than thinking quietly about what you'd like your character to do. Number 10. GoldenEye 007 2010. Wii. The Nintendo 64 version of GoldenEye 007 became an unexpectedly complicated licensing nightmare. In addition to the obvious Bond license, the game was published by Nintendo, yet was developed by Rare, a company that is now owned by Microsoft. Making all of these companies happy enough to allow for a port or a virtual console release proved to be impossible, but there was a left-field solution. Just make a different game with the same name. Points for thinking outside the box, Eurocom. As such, GoldenEye 007 has far more differences to than similarities with the previous game, and unlike GoldenEye Rogue Agent, this one does actually draw direct inspiration from the film. It does so, however, in a way that mixes two different eras of Bond, replacing Pierce Brosnan with Daniel Craig and reworking it to fit the grittier, more grounded films that had been released since. Critics and fans enjoyed it well enough. It scored 81% on Metacritic, which is certainly good, but was a notable step down from the Nintendo 64 game's 96%. The game was released for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 1 year later as GoldenEye 007 Reloaded. It's essentially the same game, but with better visuals, as it was running on hardware more advanced than an electric blanket.
Number 9. Quantum of Solace, 2008 DS. When console games get concurrent handheld releases, things can go one of two ways. Developers can either reimagine the experience as something that plays to the strengths of the hardware, or they can rip pieces off the console version until it fits onto a smaller cart and then wonder why nobody likes it. Thankfully though, Quantum of Solace does the former, and it does it quite well. It's almost as though developer Vicarious Visions had seen a DS before and knew how it worked. Wow, what a concept. It's far from the best DS game, but it is well designed. You hold the DS open like a book, with nearly all of the action being controlled on the touchscreen. It takes some getting used to, but fortunately, this version of Quantum of Solace isn't as action-focused as its console counterparts. It's paced slowly, with an emphasis on stealth and exploration. There is combat, and that combat is terrible, but that ends up being little more than an unfortunate hiccup in an otherwise solid game. The soundtrack is excellent too, and there's even a surprising amount of voice acting. Put aside some difficulty with the camera and the fact that it's probably more fun to engage in armed combat in real life, and you've got the one Quantum of Solace game that deserved more attention than it got. Number 8. Agent Under Fire, 2001, GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. Agent Under Fire was originally meant to be, well, pretty much anything other than Agent Under Fire. It began life as an upgraded PS2 version of The World Is Not Enough, which would also then be ported to PC. However, due to EA being EA, the project was scrapped despite the fact that the game was almost complete. To avoid all of the development going to waste, the team started work on another James Bond game, which at various points was meant to be either a direct successor to Rare's GoldenEye, or a retro throwback to the tone of Bond's earlier adventures, which would have seen Sir Roger Moore reprising his role as 007. With all that in mind, it's something of a miracle that Agent Under Fire is as good as it is. Not that it's great, but with so many hiccups in development, the game could have been far more disjointed and ramshackle. Instead, it's a competent, if unremarkable, shooter, and its troubled development is really only reflected in the game's short length of around 3 or 4 hours. It does have its moments of genuine charm, such as the fun driving sections and surprisingly intense rail shooter sequences, but it's let down by dull gunplay and completely pointless stealth mechanics. You could do far worse, but nearly all of the original plans for this game sounded better than what we got. Number 7. Everything or Nothing, 2003, Game Boy Advance. There is a list of things that must be avoided if you're going to release a successful James Bond game on the Game Boy Advance. Number 1, don't make a first-person shooter. And that's it. I didn't say it was a long list. Everything or Nothing beat its console counterpart to the market, and it does an excellent job of providing fun action on the go. But does it actually feel like a James Bond game? Well, sort of, at times. I mean, it clearly is a James Bond game. It doesn't play as though some obscure Japanese mascot got subbed out in the localization process. It's just that it's missing a lot of the suave, smooth Bond spirit. What we do get is a difficult but usually fair game that mixes gunplay with stealth and tosses in a few vehicle sequences to boot. It's a varied package that critics complained was a bit too short, but I honestly think it's more accurate to say that it doesn't wear out its welcome. Also, it's the sort of game that feels more satisfying to play multiple times, as you go from fumbling your way through a level to achieving a kind of graceful mastery, something that's reinforced by the game's smooth animations. This one is often ignored, but it is worth a second glance. Number 6, From Russia with Love, 2005, GameCube, PlayStation 2, PlayStation Portable, and Xbox. 32 years after the release of the film, and 22 years since Sean Connery last played the character, and that's if you count Never Say Never Again, which you shouldn't, the venerable Scotsman returned as James Bond. In a video game, which he clearly did not care about, and which he almost certainly did because he needed the money, and which, you know what, let's just stop there because I'm depressed already. There is a certain thrill in playing as the young and spry Connery, but it's offset by the fact that he's voiced by the old and tired Connery. To be clear, people age, we certainly aren't shaming a man for having grown older with time, but his performance here seems hollow and disengaged, as nice as it is to have him back. If it sounds strange that developer EA wouldn't base the character on the then current incarnation of Bond, well, there was no current incarnation of Bond. The game was developed after Pierce Brosnan relinquished the role, but before Daniel Craig took up the mantle in 2006 with Casino Royale. No, still not that one. The gameplay itself is pedestrian but passable. The real draw is the ability to play through the different world of the 1960s films, roaming the environments and meeting with characters drawn from Connery's entire tenure. It's a good time, but there are glimmers of true brilliance that aren't fully realised. As it stands, it is a worthy experience, but it was so close to being a must-play. Number 5, Bloodstone, 2010, DS, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC. The only Daniel Craig-era Bond game with a completely unique story, Bloodstone is helped along by a solid performance by Craig himself and a story by Bruce Firestein, who wrote 3 Bond films and that's about it. But still, 3 Bond films is pretty good. Bloodstone is not going to scratch your itch for innovative third-person action, but it honestly might scratch your itch for a perfectly serviceable original Bond adventure. Craig's Bond lends himself well to traditional duck-and-cover gameplay, and outside of some unfortunate cutscenes in which Dame Judi Dench is played by this potato, it looks fantastic. What's more, Bloodstone is our first indication on this list that the games have a better success rate when it comes to theme songs than the movies do. Here, it's I'll Take It All by Joss Stone. Wait, hang on, Joss Stone? Bloodstone? Are you trying to be clever, video game? You've seen the other stuff on this list and you know full well that being clever is frowned upon. The DS version does a great job of translating the bulk of the experience to a less powerful handheld. It looks substantially worse, but the touchscreen aiming works great. Critics actually preferred this version by a surprising margin, awarding it 75% on Metacritic, while it scored between 63 and 66% on its main platforms. Number 4, The World Is Not Enough, 2000, Nintendo 64. We wouldn't have guessed family-friendly Nintendo consoles to be the right home for drinking, shooting, STI-spreading protagonists, but for a decent run of titles, they were indeed where you'd find the best James Bond games. Case in point, The World Is Not Enough, which, okay, is not the best James Bond game, but it is the best James Bond game with the name The World Is Not Enough. So, that's something. Developed by Eurocom, who would go on to helm the GoldenEye 007 remake 10 years later, the Nintendo 64 version of The World Is Not Enough is far superior to the PlayStation version because it runs. Yes, it looks nicer and plays better, but the fact that it's functional and not a buggy, stuttery mess is worth spotlighting on its own. Also, it doesn't just have a multiplayer mode, it has a huge number of multiplayer modes with a ton of varied maps, seemingly only so it could kick PlayStation owners while they were down. It isn't perfect. The character models, for instance, look like somebody glued the actor's flesh to some pool toys. Also, the AI wasn't great, and the mission objectives didn't leave much room for creativity. But if you like Bond games, this is one of the worthier entries. If you don't like Bond games, why on earth have you watched this much of the video? I mean, do keep watching, it's good for the algorithm. Thanks for being here. Number 3, Everything or Nothing, 2004, GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. Do you want a fun fact? Of course you do. Who doesn't want a fun fact? Ready? The name of Eon Productions, the film company that still produces James Bond films to this day, is an acronym standing for Everything or Nothing. Pretty classy of this game to reference it as its title, and it's appropriate that it's also regarded as one of the better Bond games since ever. We get another great original theme song here, this time by Maya, who also voices a character. She's joined by an excellent cast featuring not only Pierce Brosnan as Bond, but Willem Dafoe, Heidi Klum, and even Richard Kiel reprising his role as Jaws. Everything or Nothing is a third-person shooter with stealth elements, and it works and controls well. Lock-on keeps the combat from ever getting frustrating, and it suits a character like James Bond more than fiddling with thumbsticks ever would, and the give-and-take nature of the shootouts is incredibly fitting for cinematic set pieces. The game also looks excellent, and it might actually do the best job of playing like a genuine interactive Bond film. Sure, the melee combat isn't great, the map during driving sequences gives you the choice between useless and useless for a different reason, and the difficulty spikes are a bit too spiky. Even so, the game brilliantly captures the Brosnan era of Bond, and we couldn't be happier with it. Well, unless it was one of the next two games, of course. That's sort of how these lists work. Number 2, Nightfire 2002, GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. Did you know there were 6 distinct James Bond games on the PlayStation 2? You might feel that's plenty, but personally, I feel there should have been one more. That way, there would have been 007 games. Oh, thank you everyone. No, you're breathtaking. Nightfire is more than a great Bond game. It gets shockingly close to being a great game in general. Is it dumb? Yes. Is it derivative? Yes. Are the twists so clearly telegraphed that you can see them from space? Oh yes. And yet it's so much fun that none of this matters. Nightfire is a direct sequel to Agent Under Fire, which itself had plenty to recommend it, but this is better in every way. It looks better, the gunplay is better, even the vehicle segments are better. Bond takes to the air and the sea in his relentless quest to shoot loads of people, and that's just the way we like it. Nightfire again has its very own theme song called Nearly Civilized by Esthero. I've never heard of them. And again, it's not half bad, meaning it's superior to 2/3 of the theme songs from the actual movies. Criticism was mainly levied at the game's short length. Fair enough, but it says something that the one thing reviewers complained about was that there wasn't more of it. Also, the split-screen multiplayer was chef's kiss levels of good.
Number 1. GoldenEye 007. 1997. Nintendo 64. A small peek into the TripleJump sausage factory if you like. Making these lists, we put ourselves in an impossible position. If we rank retro games higher due to their legacy, we receive pushback that the games haven't aged well. If we rank them low because they haven't aged well, we receive pushback for not focusing on their legacy. And here's the thing, we get it. We absolutely understand different people value different things in video games. For some, it's how well the games play today, picking them up for the first time. For others, it's the way those games made them feel as children or young adults, gathered around a console with friends on long nights, munching on snacks and enjoying time together without a single care in the world.
That is the dilemma we face when ranking older games, but surely we can at least all agree that as far as James Bond games specifically go, and as far as multiplayer games in general go, few have been as beloved as GoldenEye 007. Maybe it's aged poorly, maybe it's nowhere near as fun to play today, maybe it's mainly notable for the better, more polished games in other franchises that it inspired, but I can't say that I much care, to be honest. Video games are intended to bring us joy. Of all the games on this list, I can't say that any other game has brought me, or probably any of you, nearly so much. It's a great Bond game, and appropriately, its multiplayer mode is a great bonding experience.
Come on, you didn't think we'd end this list on sincerity instead of a bad pun, did you? GoldenEye 007, baby, you're the best. Yes, I know that's a song from a different film. I don't remember the lyrics to GoldenEye.